My name is Lily Wilson. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside large organizations, places with clean glass walls, carefully worded mission statements, and systems that appear fair as long as you don't look too closely. People usually describe me as steady, not loud, not demanding, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks. At work, I was often labeled reliable, sometimes low maintenance. Those words sound complimentary, but they also come with an unspoken assumption that I don't need much, that I won't push back, that I'll accept what's given and quietly make it work. I've learned that when you're calm, thoughtful, and consistent, people often mistake that for passivity. They think they figured you out. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or public takedowns. There are no villains shouting in boardrooms, no triumphant music swelling at the end. What I'm sharing is quieter than that, and more common than most people realize. It's about how financial systems inside corporations can become opaque by design, about how information is selectively shared, about how bonuses, incentives, and recognition can quietly disappear when no one expects you to ask questions, and about what happens when the person who was never supposed to notice does. When I first discovered that a bonus I had earned was hidden from me, not denied, not delayed, but never disclosed, my reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion, then curiosity, and finally, clarity. What followed wasn't a single moment of confrontation, but a long sequence of small, deliberate decisions made in silence. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through how I was perceived, how that perception shaped my role, and how I slowly realized the system around me depended on my invisibility. I'll share what it feels like to recognize manipulation not as malice, but as routine, and how choosing restraint, documentation, and timing can quietly rebalance power without burning bridges or breaking laws. I'm telling this story honestly, not to position myself as a hero and not to shame anyone involved. Most of the people who benefited from my silence likely never thought of themselves as doing anything wrong. That's part of what makes these situations so difficult to name. If you've ever sensed that something about your workplace didn't add up, but couldn't quite prove it, if you've ever been praised for being easy to work with while feeling increasingly invisible, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was costing you more than you realized, then this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever felt that being calm and capable made people assume you didn't need to be fully informed? To them, I was dependable background noise, not invisible in the sense of being ignored entirely, but invisible in the way infrastructure is invisible. You don't thank the wiring for carrying electricity. You only notice it when something breaks. I was the person things didn't break around. In meetings, I was introduced with efficiency, not enthusiasm. This is Lily. She handles operations. No adjectives after that, no embellishment, just a function. I spoke when it was necessary. I listened when it wasn't. I didn't interrupt. I didn't posture. Over time, people began to relax around me, not because I was comforting, but because I was predictable. I made their work easier. I filled gaps. I caught errors before they surfaced. I stayed late when timelines slipped and didn't announce it the next morning. That reliability became my identity. When projects succeeded, credit flowed upward and outward. When something needed fixing quietly, it flowed to me. I wasn't resentful about that, at least not at first. I told myself this was how systems worked, that contribution didn't always equal visibility, that professionalism meant not keeping score. And I believed that, because believing it made everything simpler. Managers trusted me with execution, not with strategy. Decisions were made around me, then handed down for implementation. I was invited into rooms late, if at all, not because I wasn't capable, but because I didn't demand presence. And in corporate environments, absence is often interpreted as consent. People assumed I was fine. They assumed I didn't want more, that I wasn't ambitious in the way they recognized. I valued stability over advancement. No one ever asked me those things directly. They just behaved as if the answers were obvious. I was described as easy, low drama, self-sufficient. Those labels sound harmless, even flattering, but they quietly shape how resources move, how information flows, how opportunities are distributed. Bonuses, for example. In my company, bonuses weren't openly discussed. They existed in policy documents and HR portals, but the real details, eligibility, discretionary adjustments, performance multipliers, lived in conversations behind closed doors. Managers explained them selectively, often framed as guidance rather than entitlement. People who negotiated were walked through the system carefully. People who didn't were assumed not to care. And I didn't ask, not because I didn't value money, but because I trusted the structure. I assumed fairness was embedded somewhere above my line of sight. I assumed if I qualified, I would be told. That was the quiet bargain I'd made with professionalism. Do the work well, and the system will do the rest. To them, that made me safe. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't in competition. I wasn't someone whose dissatisfaction needed managing. I was the kind of employee you don't plan around, because you assume she'll always adjust. Looking back, I could see how that perception solidified, how small moments reinforced it. A meeting where my analysis was summarized by someone else. A project scope was expanded without discussion because Lily can handle it. A performance review that praised my consistency without once mentioning growth. None of it felt hostile. That's important. There were no raised voices, no insults, no overt dismissal, just a steady pattern of being placed exactly where I was most useful and least disruptive. And I accepted that placement. I told myself this was maturity, that ego had no place in good work, that patience would be rewarded eventually. I watched colleagues advocate loudly for themselves, sometimes clumsily, and told myself I preferred my way. Quiet, competent, contained. What I didn't realize yet was that systems don't reward silence. They use it. They optimize around it. And once you've been categorized as someone who doesn't need explaining, correcting, or compensating in full, that category is remarkably sticky. To them, I was someone who would keep things running, someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions, someone who didn't need to see the whole picture. And for a long time, I lived inside that version of myself without challenging it, not because I lacked awareness, but because nothing had yet forced me to look closer. That would come later, much later. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what makes it easy to dismiss, both in real time and in memory. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't feel like a violation. It was just off, slightly misaligned, like a picture frame you don't notice until you're standing still long enough. It happened during a routine year-end check-in, not a performance review. Those were formal, documented, sanitized. This was one of those casual conversations managers schedule when budgets are closing and everyone is tired. A conversation framed as alignment, not evaluation. My manager leaned back in his chair, laptop half closed, and thanked me for holding everything together during a difficult quarter. He mentioned long hours, cross-team coordination, the way I'd stepped in when another analyst left unexpectedly. Then he said, almost as an aside, "This year was tight, but we made sure to take care of people." I nodded, not because I understood what he meant, but because nodding was my default. A pause followed, just long enough for a clarification to arrive. It didn't. The meeting moved on. New priorities, next quarter. A quick smile. Done. Later that afternoon, I overheard two colleagues talking near the coffee machine. Nothing secretive, just tired end-of-year chatter. One of them laughed and said, "At least the bonus softened the blow." The other replied, "Yeah, I didn't expect that adjustment." Adjustment. That word stayed with me. I didn't insert myself into the conversation. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I told myself it was none of my business. Different roles, different arrangements. Maybe they were talking about something else entirely. But a small question lodged itself somewhere behind my thoughts. Adjustment to what? That evening, I logged into the internal portal. Compensation statements were posted there. Base salary, benefits, and generic summaries. I scanned mine. Everything looked normal. No bonus line item. No explanation either way. Just absence. Absence is easy to rationalize. I told myself bonuses were discretionary. That may be because the company skipped them this year. If something applied to me, I would have been told directly. After all, my manager was thorough. He appreciated my work. He wouldn't intentionally omit something important. That belief mattered to me, so I let it go. But the mind doesn't release questions it hasn't answered. It just pushes them deeper. Over the next few weeks, small comments accumulated. Not confirmations, hints, references to payouts, casual mentions of percentages, a celebratory lunch I wasn't invited to because it was just for the client-facing team, even though my work had directly supported the contract. Each moment was individually explainable. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't yet want to name. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even suspicious in a confrontational sense. I was alert, attuned in a way I hadn't been before. I started listening differently. When people talked about compensation, I noticed how carefully they spoke, how language shifted around specifics. When managers referenced rewards, I noticed how rarely they used definitive statements. Everything was framed as context, never commitment. And I noticed something else. No one checked whether I understood. In conversations where bonuses were mentioned obliquely, people glanced at each other, but not at me. Not because they were hiding something maliciously, but because I wasn't part of the mental map where clarification was necessary. That realization was uncomfortable. It suggested that my silence wasn't neutral. It was being interpreted. Still, I didn't act. I told myself I didn't have enough information. That raises the question, would be awkward. Maybe I was misreading the situation and would only embarrass myself by asking. So I waited for certainty. But certainty doesn't arrive on its own inside systems built on opacity. It has to be extracted. And at that point, I wasn't ready to extract anything. What I did instead was remember. I remembered the phrasing, the timing, the way the conversation moved smoothly past something that might have included me, but didn't. That first small cut wasn't painful. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand immediate attention. But it changed how I held the frame. Once you notice a misalignment, you can't unsee it. And even if you choose to ignore it, some part of you starts quietly measuring the distance between what you're told and what you're not. That was the moment something shifted from unconscious trust to conscious observation. I just didn't know yet how far that shift would take me. After that first moment, nothing happened. And that, in many ways, was the problem. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, work continued, deadlines arrived and were met, new projects replaced old ones. The absence of clarity around compensation settled into the background, becoming one more undefined shape in a landscape full of them. This is how normalization begins, not with agreement, but with fatigue. The next time bonuses were referenced, it was during a team-wide call. Leadership thanked everyone for their efforts and mentioned that incentives had been distributed according to performance and impact. The phrase sounded precise. It wasn't. No one asked for definitions. No one requested breakdowns. Cameras stayed off. Microphones stayed muted. The call moved on. I sat at my desk, hands folded, listening to a familiar internal dialogue begin its quiet work. Maybe my contribution was already reflected in my base salary. Maybe operations roles are weighted differently. Maybe this is just how it is. That last thought was the most dangerous, because it closed the conversation before it could even start. I noticed that when colleagues spoke openly about bonuses, they did so with the confidence of people who had been clearly informed. They knew what they'd been measured on. They knew how their numbers were calculated. Some had negotiated targets at the start of the year. I hadn't, not because I was excluded outright, but because no one had offered, and I hadn't asked. And each time the cycle repeated, it became easier to tell myself that silence was the professional choice, that asking now would feel late, petty, like I was retroactively trying to change rules I'd already agreed to. Except I hadn't agreed to anything. I'd simply gone along with what was placed in front of me. There's a particular kind of disrespect that thrives on politeness. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't bruise the ego directly. It relies on your own restraint to do its work for it. When a meeting ended without my input, I told myself my contribution had already been factored in. When the scope expanded without compensation, I told myself that flexibility was valued. When recognition went elsewhere, I told myself outcomes mattered more than credit. All of those things can be true in healthy environments. The difference is choice. I hadn't chosen any of it. I'd adapted. And adaptation over time begins to look like consent. The real shift happened quietly during a performance cycle review. My evaluation was positive, very positive. Strong ratings, words like essential, stabilizing, and trusted. Then came the section on growth. It was vague. No clear path forward. No mention of increased responsibility translating into increased reward. Just encouragement to continue doing what you're doing. I remember closing the document and sitting still for a long moment. That's when the pattern finally named itself. I wasn't being overlooked because of incompetence. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't even being undervalued in the emotional sense. I was being contained, placed in a role that absorbed pressure without redistributing power. And once I saw that, it became harder to pretend I hadn't. Still, I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but calculation. I knew enough by then to understand that asking the wrong question at the wrong time could reset the narrative in ways that weren't favorable. I didn't yet know what leverage I had, or even if I had any. I only knew that speaking without preparation would relieve my discomfort, but cost me clarity. So I observed. I paid attention to who had regular compensation conversations with leadership. I noticed who was encouraged to set goals tied to incentives and who wasn't. I watched how praise was distributed publicly and how rewards were handled privately, and I noticed that no one corrected my assumptions. No one said, by the way, here's how your bonus works. No one checked whether I'd received the same information as others. No one asked whether I had questions. The system functioned smoothly without my understanding, and that told me something important. My silence wasn't accidental anymore. It was expected. And that realization was uncomfortable enough to sit with, but not yet sharp enough to force action. So I did what many people do when they sense imbalance but lack proof. I normalized it. I folded the discomfort into routine. I convinced myself that stability was worth more than clarity, that fairness would eventually catch up. What I didn't realize then was that normalization isn't passive. It trains others how to treat you. And the longer it goes unchallenged, the more effort it takes to reverse. By the end of that cycle, I wasn't just quiet. I was predictable, and predictability, in systems built on asymmetry, is rarely an accident. It wasn't given to me in writing. No one sat me down and explained it. But by the time I understood the role I'd been assigned, it had already been reinforced dozens of times through small, consistent signals. I was the stabilizer. The person was brought in when something was behind schedule, when a process was breaking down, when two departments couldn't communicate without friction. I was the one who translated, absorbed, and smoothed things over. Not a leader, not a decision maker, a buffer. In meetings, my job was to clarify, not to challenge. I was asked for data, not opinions, execution plans, not direction. When I did offer insight that edged toward strategy, it was often acknowledged politely and then reframed by someone else. Right, building on what Lily said. And suddenly the idea belonged to the room, not to me. I didn't object. At first, I didn't even notice. Because being useful feels good. Being needed feels like security, and when you've built a reputation on dependability, it's easy to confuse that with influence. But influence has visibility, and I had very little of that. Over time, I noticed how my role contrasted with others at my level. Colleagues with similar tenure were being positioned differently. They were encouraged to lead initiatives. Their names were attached to outcomes. Their performance conversations included language about trajectory. Mine didn't. Mine focused on continuity. You're such a constant. We can always rely on you. You keep things from falling apart. Those statements weren't untrue, but they were incomplete, and they carried an implication that my value was in maintenance, not momentum. The clearest signal came during a reorganization. Roles were shifting, new titles were being discussed. A few people were moved into more visible positions, some deservedly, some less so. When the dust settled, my responsibilities had expanded, but my title hadn't changed. When I asked, carefully, neutrally, about the discrepancy, the answer was gentle. We didn't want to disrupt what's working. That sentence landed heavily. What's working? For whom? I realized then that my role wasn't defined by my capabilities, but by how comfortably others could rely on them without renegotiation. I was the person whose output could be increased without corresponding recalibration. That's a role organizations quietly assign to people they believe won't push back. And I had confirmed that belief again and again. I started seeing how this role shaped information flow. Strategic discussions happened without me, then the results were handed down for execution. Budget conversations occurred elsewhere. Compensation frameworks were discussed abstractly, if at all, in my presence. I wasn't being excluded because I was untrustworthy. I was being excluded because I was contained. Contained roles don't need full transparency, they need compliance. And compliance doesn't require understanding, just reliability. Once I saw that, something in me shifted from confusion to recognition. Not anger, not yet, just a clear-eyed understanding of the box I'd been placed in, and how neatly I'd fit inside it. I also saw how easy it would be to stay there. The role came with praise, with a sense of being indispensable, with the quiet comfort of knowing I wouldn't be challenged too hard or scrutinized too closely. It also came with limits. Limits on growth, limits on compensation, limits on how seriously my silence was interpreted. And limits, once internalized, are hard to undo. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand reclassification. I didn't suddenly change my behavior. That would have signaled disruption, and I wasn't ready to disrupt anything yet. Instead, I paid attention to the edges of the role. What information wasn't given? What decisions I wasn't invited to? What assumptions were made about what I needed or didn't? And in doing so, I began to understand something important. This role wasn't permanent because it was correct. It was permanent because it was convenient. Convenient roles persist until they become costly. And at that point, they're often adjusted quietly, without apology. The question that began forming, slowly, cautiously, was whether I wanted to wait for that adjustment to happen to me, or whether I wanted to understand the system well enough to choose when and how it would change. I didn't answer that question yet, but once it existed, it didn't go away. The shift didn't happen during a meeting or a conversation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the kind of moment that doesn't feel important until you realize it's dividing your life into before and after. I was reviewing a routine report, one I'd built myself years earlier and had been maintaining ever since. It tracked operational efficiency across teams, timelines, resource allocation, and cost variances. I knew the structure so well I could almost read it without looking. That day I noticed a discrepancy. Not an error, not a typo, a pattern. A line item related to performance incentives appeared in a summary view that wasn't accessible through my usual dashboard. It wasn't meant for me. I only saw it because I'd been temporarily granted broader access while covering for someone else. The number wasn't attached to a name. It was aggregated, but it was real, and it was larger than I expected. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. Not because I immediately understood what I was seeing, but because something in my body recognized significance before my mind caught up. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't forward anything. I didn't even scroll further. I closed the file. That restraint surprised me. Old habits would have pushed me to rationalize it away immediately, to assume it had nothing to do with me, to trust that if it mattered, someone would explain. But something had changed. Instead of dismissing the moment, I held it. That evening, I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen, not even in vague terms. I went home, made dinner, and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened my notebook. Not the digital one, The physical one I kept for my own thinking, the one without search bars or timestamps or audit trails, the one that existed only for clarity. I wrote down what I'd noticed. Exactly. No conclusions, no accusations, just facts and questions. Why was this line item aggregated? Who had access to this view? What criteria triggered inclusion? The act of writing slowed my thoughts. It separated emotion from observation. And in that separation, something subtle but powerful occurred. I stopped asking whether I deserved anything. I started asking how the system actually worked. That shift, from self evaluation to structural analysis, changed everything. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to the architecture of information. Not just what was visible, but what was deliberately obscured, which reports were widely accessible, which required special permissions, which summaries flattened details that might raise questions if viewed individually. I realized that opacity wasn't accidental. It was a design choice, not necessarily malicious, but protective. It reduced friction, it prevented negotiation fatigue, it kept compensation discussions contained to those who were expected to have them. And I wasn't expected to. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I understood then that nothing would change unless I changed how I engaged with the system. Not by demanding explanations, but by understanding leverage. Not by emotional appeals, but by precision. Still, I didn't act outwardly. I continued to perform my role exactly as before. I delivered on deadlines. I supported transitions. I responded quickly and thoroughly. If anything, I became more composed. Internally, though, a line had been crossed. I was no longer assuming fairness by default. I was verifying. I wasn't interpreting silence as neutrality. I was recognizing it as a signal. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped believing that clarity would be offered freely. Clarity, I realized, was something you either earned, negotiated, or uncovered. That afternoon didn't give me answers. It gave me orientation. I knew then that I didn't need to rush, that asking the right question too early would collapse the space I needed to understand the full picture. I also knew that once I truly understood that picture, I wouldn't be able to return to not knowing. So I moved carefully. I documented quietly. I mapped access points. I paid attention to timing, when data refreshed, when approvals were logged, when adjustments were made. All without changing my expression, without signaling concern, without asking for anything. The shift wasn't visible, but it was decisive. From that day forward, I wasn't just inside the system. I was studying it. Once I understood that clarity wouldn't be offered, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct formed from years of professionalism and trust. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen. Outwardly, nothing about me appeared different. I still arrived prepared, still followed through, still responded to messages promptly and without edge. If anything, my demeanor grew calmer, more contained. People read that calmly as acceptance. They always had. What they didn't realize was that silence can mean two very different things. One is disengagement, the other is observation. I was very engaged. I began to notice how often assumptions were made in my presence, assumptions that relied on my not asking questions. Budget reallocations are explained vaguely, timelines shifted without rationale. Incentive language softened into generalities when I was in the room. No one checked whether I needed more detail. In fact, the less I spoke, the more comfortable others seemed to become. That comfort was instructive. It told me that my questions, when they came, would matter. And that meant timing would matter even more. I resisted the urge to seek an immediate resolution. That urge is powerful, especially when you sense unfairness. But resolution without leverage often just resets the imbalance under a new justification. So instead, I let people underestimate me. They mistook my quiet for compliance, my calm for contentment. My continued performance is for the agreement. In subtle ways, they began to rely on that interpretation. I was copied less on strategic emails, invited later into conversations, given outcomes instead of context. And that narrowing of my official view actually sharpened my unofficial one. When you're not part of the decision-making theater, You can see patterns more clearly. You notice what changes after meetings, what data shifts before announcements, which numbers stabilize, and which fluctuate quietly in the background. I began keeping careful notes, not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the process. Dates, language used, versions of the same story are told to different audiences. I noticed how compensation conversations were framed differently depending on who was present. With some employees, bonuses were discussed as incentives, tools to motivate future performance. With others, they were framed as rewards, recognition for past contribution. With me, they were rarely discussed at all. That absence wasn't an oversight anymore, it was consistent. And consistency implies intention, even if it isn't malicious. Still, I didn't correct it. Silence at this stage was protective. I knew that once I spoke, the dynamic would shift. People would become careful, explanations would appear, narratives would solidify, and I would lose the unfiltered view I currently have. So I stayed quiet. And in doing so, I noticed something else. People began to confide in me, not intentionally, not with awareness, but because I was perceived as neutral, non-threatening, not someone who would escalate or politicize what they said. Casual remarks slipped out, frustrations, assumptions about who was taken care of and who probably didn't care. Those comments were never cruel, just careless. And carelessness reveals structure. I learned who negotiated annually and who didn't, who had compensation benchmarks discussed explicitly, and who was assumed to be satisfied with stability. I learned how often decisions were made based not on performance, but on the expectation of resistance. That realization was sobering. It meant fairness wasn't just about contribution. It was about visibility and friction, about how much effort someone required to keep the content. And I required very little, or so they thought. The irony is that my silence gave me access to information I would have lost had I asserted myself too early, access to the underlying logic of the system. I wasn't waiting to explode. I wasn't collecting grievances. I was learning the rules. By the time anyone might have noticed that I hadn't asked about bonuses in years, it was already assumed that I never would. That assumption became a kind of cover. Behind it, I built clarity. Not loudly, not emotionally, just carefully. And while others mistook my quiet for weakness, I understood it as something else entirely. It was patience. And patience, when paired with understanding, is a form of strength most systems don't account for. What they never noticed was how much information passes through the hands of someone considered non-political. Because I wasn't seen as ambitious in the traditional sense, I was trusted with logistics, with the process, with cleanup, with transitions. I was given temporary access just to help, asked to sanity check numbers, and invited to sit in on handovers when others left. None of that looked like power, but power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as responsibility. I began to understand the system not from the top down, but from the seams. I saw where data was summarized and where detail was lost. I noticed how performance metrics were translated into financial outcomes, not directly, but through layers of interpretation. I watched how discretionary adjustments were justified in language that sounded objective, while remaining flexible enough to be selectively applied. And I documented everything, quietly, methodically, without judgment. I didn't just track numbers, I tracked timing. When reviews were finalized, when approvals happened, when corrections were made retroactively, I noted who initiated those changes and who merely executed them. Patterns emerged. Bonuses weren't denied arbitrarily. They were redistributed through ambiguity, through silence, through assumptions about who would notice and who wouldn't. I saw that eligibility wasn't binary. It was elastic. Performance thresholds could be interpreted generously or conservatively depending on context. And context was shaped by conversation, not policy. I also noticed something crucial. My work directly supported outcomes that were being financially rewarded elsewhere. Projects I stabilized fed into revenue milestones credited to other teams. The efficiency gains I implemented reduced costs that improved overall margins. My contributions were visible in aggregate, but invisible in attribution. that invisibility wasn't accidental. Attribution creates obligation, and obligation creates negotiation. By keeping my contributions diffuse, the system avoided both. I didn't rush to confront this realization. I sat with it, cross-checked it, made sure I wasn't projecting intent where there was only inertia. But the evidence accumulated. I began to understand that my bonus hadn't been forgotten. It had been absorbed, folded into pools, adjusted away through language, normalized out of existence by my own silence. That understanding didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I refined my documentation, I aligned dates with policy language, I reviewed internal guidelines, especially the parts most people skimmed. I noticed where wording allowed for discretion and where it required disclosure. And then I positioned myself, not by posturing, but by becoming indispensable in very specific ways. I volunteered for cross-functional audits. I supported compliance reviews. I became the person who understood how numbers moved from raw data to executive summaries. In doing so, I gained something far more valuable than visibility. I gained fluency. I could now speak the language of justification, of variance, of audit trails. I understood which questions could be answered casually and which triggered formal processes by their very nature. And still I said nothing, because by now silence wasn't just patience, it was alignment. I knew that when I eventually spoke, I wouldn't be asking for fairness as a favor. I would be asking for clarity as a requirement. And systems respond very differently to those two things. What they never noticed was that the person they'd categorized as low friction had quietly become high context, that the one they assumed wouldn't question had learned exactly how questions worked. They never noticed the notebook, never noticed the timestamps, never noticed that I no longer relied on assumptions. They saw the same Lily they'd always seen. And that was the point, because preparation doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, it waits, it sharpens. And by the time I was finished preparing, I no longer wondered if something had been taken from me. I knew how. The moment of confirmation didn't arrive with adrenaline. There was no rush, no surge of triumph, just a slow, steady tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when uncertainty finally collapses into fact. I was reviewing historical incentive documentation, not the polished summaries, but archived policy revisions and internal guidance notes, materials rarely revisited once updated. I had legitimate access through a compliance-related project, and I took my time. That's when I saw it. A clause, buried deep, quietly consistent across multiple years. It outlined eligibility for discretionary performance incentives tied to operational impact, specifically roles whose contributions materially affected revenue stability or cost containment, even if they weren't client-facing. My role, not hypothetically, explicitly. The language was careful, but unmistakable. It described work I had been doing for years, work that had been formally acknowledged in performance reviews, work that had been referenced repeatedly as critical. I cross-referenced it with payout schedules, then with aggregated distributions, then with timelines. The alignment was exact. There was no scenario in which I was ineligible. I sat there for a long time, not moving. Not because I was shocked, but because something else was happening. Relief. Relief that I hadn't imagined it. That my instincts hadn't been exaggerations or entitlement. That the quiet sense of imbalance had a concrete shape. And alongside that relief came something heavier. Understanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an administrative oversight. It wasn't even a single decision. It was a pattern of omission. My eligibility had never been denied. It had simply never been disclosed. And because I hadn't asked, the system had continued without friction. No policy had been broken, but responsibility had been avoided. I didn't print anything. I didn't forward emails. I didn't confront anyone with documents. Because what I had found wasn't ammunition. It was leverage. Leverage doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be precise. I reviewed the documentation again slowly. I noted the language that triggered mandatory disclosure versus discretionary explanation. I paid attention to where accountability shifted, from manager to department, from department to HR, from HR to policy. And I realized something critical. If I asked the right question, at the right level, the system would be required to answer. Not emotionally, not defensively, formally. And formal answers create records. That's when I understood why I felt so calm. There was no need for confrontation, no need for accusation, no need for urgency. The system itself would do the work, if engaged correctly. I closed my notebook that evening with a sense of completion I hadn't expected. Not satisfied, not vindication. Clarity. I knew exactly where I stood, exactly what had happened, exactly what could and could not be denied. And I also knew something else. Once I moved forward, there would be no returning to ambiguity, no pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen, no slipping back into the role of the unknowing stabilizer. This wasn't about back pay alone. It was about redefining how I was positioned within the structure, about whether I would continue to be someone whose understanding was optional or someone whose understanding was assumed. I slept well that night, not because I'd won anything, but because I no longer doubted myself. The next step wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be rushed, but it would be irreversible. Once you know the truth, you still have choices. That was the part no one talks about, the space between awareness and action. The quiet, uncomfortable pause where nothing is forced yet, but everything is possible. I listed my options carefully, not in my head, but on paper. The first was the simplest. Say nothing. I could continue as I was. I had stability, respect, a reputation for reliability. I could quietly accept what had happened as the cost of my temperament. Many people do, and the system would reward that choice with predictability. The second option was to ask informally, a casual conversation with my manager, a neutral question framed as curiosity. Can you help me understand how bonuses work for my role? That path offered deniability for everyone. It would likely result in explanations, maybe even a small adjustment going forward. But it would also reset the narrative. Any past omissions would be reframed as misunderstandings, and whatever clarity I gained would exist only verbally. No record, no accountability. The third option was to escalate emotionally, to express disappointment, to describe how overlooked I felt, to seek validation before resolution. That option tempted me briefly, not because I wanted drama, but because it promised immediate relief. Being heard feels good. Being understood feels human. But emotion is easy to acknowledge and easy to dismiss. It invites sympathy, not correction. I crossed that option out quickly. Then there was the fourth option. Engage the system formally, not with accusation, but with a request for clarification grounded in policy, a request that required a written response, a question that activated review protocols without triggering defensiveness. This option wouldn't feel personal. It would feel procedural. And procedures don't unhappen. I understood the cost of this choice immediately. Once I asked that question, my role would shift. I would no longer be the quiet constant. I would become someone who understood the rules and expected them to be applied. There would be discomfort, conversations, possibly resistance, but there would also be alignment. I took a long time deciding, not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I was weighing identity. Who did I want to be after this? Someone who benefited quietly from a correction and returned to invisibility? Or someone who accepted that understanding systems carries responsibility? In the end, the decision made itself. I didn't want to win back something that should never have been withheld and then pretend nothing had changed. So I chose the irreversible option. I drafted a message. Clear, neutral, specific. No blame, no narrative, just a reference to policy language and a request for explanation regarding how incentive eligibility had been applied to my role over the past cycles. I sent it to HR, with my manager included, and then I closed my laptop. Not dramatically, not with shaking hands, just with a sense of finality. That email wasn't a confrontation. It was a line. Once crossed, there would be no returning to assumptions, no more relying on good faith without verification. No more accepting silence as neutrality. Whatever happened next, it would happen in the open. And that, more than any payout, was the shift I had been preparing for. After I sent the message, I didn't follow up. That restraint was intentional. In corporate environments, silence after a formal request does something subtle. It transfers urgency. The person who asks and waits calmly signals confidence. The person who receives and delays feels the pressure. Days passed. My calendar stayed full. My workload didn't change. No one mentioned the email in meetings. No one pulled me aside to talk things through. On the surface, nothing had happened. Underneath, processes had started moving. HR acknowledgments are never emotional. They arrive as receipts, automated confirmations, polite notes indicating that a review is underway. That's exactly what I received. No promises, no timelines, just recognition. That was enough. I continued documenting, not because I expected retaliation, but because clarity requires continuity. I tracked response times, language used, who was looped in, and when. Each of these details told me where responsibility was being placed. I noticed that my manager became more careful, not distant, just precise. He looped me into conversations he hadn't before, shared more context, asked for confirmation in writing rather than assuming alignment. It wasn't an apology, it was an adjustment. Others didn't notice the shift, or if they did, they interpreted it as natural evolution, seniority, trust. Only I understood what had changed. The system was now aware that I understood it. Meanwhile, HR requested documentation, not from me, but from management. Performance evaluations, role descriptions, historical incentive criteria. That distinction mattered. I wasn't being asked to justify myself. The system was being asked to justify its application, and justification creates exposure. Still, I said nothing publicly. I didn't hint, I didn't confide, I didn't even allow myself to imagine outcomes. I focused on execution, because while reviews were happening quietly, I was still inside the structure. And structures respond poorly to perceived disruption. I maintained composure, delivered clean work, met deadlines. I became paradoxically more invisible in demeanor, while becoming far more visible in record. Weeks passed. Then, an update. A meeting request, short, purposeful, HR included, my manager included. No subject line drama, just compensation review discussion. I accepted the invite without response. In preparation, I reviewed my notes, not to rehearse arguments, but to anchor myself in facts. I reminded myself that I didn't need to persuade. The policy already had. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a correction. What struck me most during that waiting period was how alone the process felt, and how empowering that solitude was. There was no audience, no validation loop. No one was telling me I was right. Just alignment between what I knew and what I'd chosen to do with that knowledge. And that alignment was steady. When the meeting finally arrived, I didn't feel nervous. I felt prepared. Not in a combative way, but in a grounded one. The system had begun to turn, slowly, formally, without spectacle. And for the first time, the outcome didn't depend on whether I was easy or understanding or low maintenance. It depended on whether the rules, as written, could withstand scrutiny. That was the quiet power of moving in silence. You don't announce change. You initiate the process, and you let the structure reveal itself. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, like a pressure change, subtle enough that no one could point to a single cause, but undeniable ones felt. After the review process began, the atmosphere around me shifted in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Requests came with more explanation than before. Decisions that used to be assumed were now clarified. Language became careful, not tense, careful. My manager asked questions he'd never asked before, not about my performance, that had never been in doubt, but about scope, about expectations, about alignment. What's reasonable? What support do you need? Let's make sure we're on the same page. To anyone else, it would have sounded like maturity, growth. Leadership is learning to manage better. But I knew what had triggered it. The system had been forced to look backward. And when systems look backward, they don't just correct, they reassess. I noticed something else too. Budgets tightened in small ways, not officially, just practically. A team lunch was canceled. A contractor extension is delayed. A discretionary expense is suddenly under review. None of it was dramatic. None of it could be traced to me directly. But resources had shifted. Money, when reallocated, leaves quiet absences behind. Colleagues began to feel it before they understood it. There was confusion, mild frustration, conversations in hallways about changes upstairs, and new scrutiny. No one connected it to compensation reviews or historical corrections. They just knew something was different. What struck me was how impersonal it all was. No one glared at me. No one accused me. In fact, no one even suspected. Because the system doesn't announce why it recalibrates. It just does. And when it does, people feel the effects without knowing the origin. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't change my tone, didn't alter my workload, didn't hint that anything was unfolding behind the scenes. I listened. I heard someone mention that approvals were taking longer now. Another joked that finance had suddenly become allergic to ambiguity. I kept my expression neutral. Inside, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but distance. Distance from the old version of myself, who would have internalized these shifts as personal responsibility, who would have tried to smooth things over, compensate, and absorb. That wasn't my role anymore, not because I demanded a new one, but because the system had quietly adjusted its understanding of me. And with that adjustment came a redistribution of weight. Responsibility moved back to where it belonged. I also noticed how quickly narratives form in the absence of clarity. People speculated about new leadership priorities, about external audits, about someone up top pushing for compliance. No one considered that the change might have originated with someone like me. That invisibility persisted and protected me. What I had done wasn't disruptive, it was corrective, and corrections rarely carry names. When the formal response finally came, it did so in writing, measured, careful, thorough. It acknowledged discrepancies in disclosure. It outlined revised interpretations. It referenced alignment with policy language. There was no apology. There didn't need to be. What mattered was the outcome and the record. Adjustments were being made, retroactively and prospectively, quietly. And as those adjustments rippled outward, others felt their edges without seeing their source. That's how systems preserve face. They don't punish, they redistribute. They normalize the new state as if it had always been intended. Watching that happen was instructive. It showed me that change doesn't require exposure, just engagement. And that's when you challenge opacity correctly. The response isn't chaos. It's recalibration. And recalibration always has consequences, even when no one knows who initiated it. By the time people realized something was wrong, it was already past the point of correction. That's the thing about formal processes. They move slowly at first, and then all at once. There's a window where adjustments can be framed as learning, where omissions can be softened into misunderstandings. And then there's the moment when documentation hardens, decisions are logged, and the narrative locks in place. That moment had arrived. I saw it not through announcements, but through behavior. Meetings were rescheduled abruptly, emails were rewritten mid-thread. Phrases like, just to clarify and for the record, began appearing with unusual frequency. People who had once spoken confidently about how things usually work now deferred, asking for confirmation before proceeding. The system was no longer relying on assumptions. It was protecting itself. My manager requested a one-on-one, not the casual kind we used to have, but a formal block on the calendar with an agenda. When we met, his tone was different, not defensive, but unsettled. He talked about process gaps, about how certain practices had evolved informally, about how no one had intended to obscure anything. I listened, and I realized something important. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about exposure. Once HR had traced the chain of discretion, how eligibility had been interpreted, who had decided not to explain, who had assumed silence meant acceptance, there was no way to reverse it quietly. You can't unask a formal question. You can't unopen a review. And you can't undocument a pattern once it's been acknowledged. People tried in small ways. A manager floated the idea of moving forward cleanly without revisiting the past. Another suggested reframing the issue as a communication improvement rather than a compensation one. Those attempts didn't fail because they were malicious. They failed because they were too late. The system had already shifted from narrative to record. I felt no urge to push harder, no need to correct them. The process no longer belonged to me. That realization brought a strange kind of calm. I watched as meetings became more cautious, as language tightened, as people realized that what had once been flexible now required justification. Some expressed frustration, not at me, but at the situation. This is becoming a thing. We never used to have to document all this. It's slowing everything down. They weren't wrong. Transparency does slow things down. It forces alignment. It removes shortcuts. It turns assumptions into questions. And once that happens, you don't get to go back to convenience. I also noticed something quieter: regret, not expressed openly, but visible in small hesitations, in glances, in the way some people avoided eye contact when compensation was mentioned, even abstractly. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what they hadn't realized they were doing. Because most systems don't operate on ill intent. They operate on momentum, on habits, on the belief that if no one complains, everything must be fine. My silence had once been interpreted as comfort. Now, its absence, its transformation into formal inquiry, had exposed that assumption for what it was. Too late to fix, too late to reframe, too late to quietly smooth over. Not because I demanded it, but because the system had already acknowledged responsibility. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want anyone punished. I didn't want apologies. I didn't want to be centered. I wanted alignment. And alignment, once formalized, doesn't disappear when people wish it would. By the end of that phase, it was clear that whatever adjustments were coming, they would stand. Not as favors, not as exceptions, as corrections. And corrections don't negotiate with comfort, they replace it. The conversation everyone expects in stories like this, the explosive one, never happened. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where I laid out evidence and watched faces fall. Instead, there was a meeting, small, quiet, controlled. HR, my manager, a prepared agenda. The tone was professional, to the point of sterility, and I understood why. This wasn't about conflict resolution. It was about closure. They walked me through their findings, carefully worded, procedural, acknowledging that while policies had been followed in spirit, certain disclosure obligations had not been met. The eligibility criteria applicable to my role had not been clearly communicated. As a result, compensation adjustments were warranted. I listened without interrupting, not because I was overwhelmed, but because there was nothing to add. The system was speaking in its own language now. They explained the corrective actions, retroactive adjustments, structural clarification going forward, documentation updates to prevent recurrence. Still no apology. That was fine. Apologies imply emotion. This was accountability. When they finished, there was a pause, the kind that invites response. I thanked them, not reflexively, not out of politeness, but because the process had worked. I asked one question, not about money, about expectations. How will eligibility and disclosure be handled for my role going forward? That question mattered more than any number. The answer was direct, clear, on record. In that moment, the confrontation, if it could be called that, ended. There was nothing left to debate. After the meeting, my manager lingered, just long enough to say something personal. I didn't realize, he said. Not defensively, just honestly. I believed him. And I also understood that realization didn't undo responsibility. It simply explained the absence of intent. I didn't reassure him. I didn't accuse him. I acknowledged the complexity. That's why clarity matters, I said. That was it. No speeches, no emotional processing. We returned to work. The difference was subtle, but permanent. He no longer assumed. He asked. He documented. And I no longer accept ambiguity as the cost of being easy to work with. Walking back to my desk, I felt lighter, not triumphant, grounded. The outcome wasn't a victory over someone. It was a recalibration of the relationship with the system and with myself. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't performed outrage. I had simply insisted, quietly and correctly, on being fully included in the rules that govern my work. And once that inclusion was formalized, there was nothing left to fight. What changed after wasn't my title. It wasn't even my workload. What changed was my orientation. Before all of this, I'd measured professionalism by how little friction I created, by how smoothly I absorbed uncertainty, by how well I made things work without asking for clarification. I thought that restraint was maturity. Now I understand it differently. Restraint isn't silence. Restraint is precision. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still not loud. Those parts of me weren't shaped by the system, and they didn't disappear once the system was challenged. But I'm no longer undefined. I ask questions early, not aggressively, but clearly. I don't wait for information to be offered if it affects my responsibilities or compensation. I don't assume fairness. I verify structure. And that shift has changed how people interact with me. Not because I became intimidating, but because I became legible. People explain more. They document more. They include me in conversations where context matters. Not because I demanded it, but because they understand that I operate with awareness. I'm no longer the stabilizer who absorbs without reflection. I'm a participant. What surprises people most, when they notice it all, is that I don't carry resentment. I don't replay what happened. I don't talk about it unless it's relevant. I don't define myself by the correction. That chapter closed cleanly because it was handled cleanly. The system adjusted. I adjusted, and life moved on. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can engage complexity without burning bridges, from understanding that power doesn't always require visibility and justice doesn't require spectacle. I still believe in professionalism, but I no longer confuse it with self-erasure. If anything, this experience clarified my values. I believe in fairness that doesn't depend on personality, in systems that can withstand scrutiny, in asking questions before discomfort turns into doubt. And I believe that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you stay that way. What I gained wasn't just compensation. It was authorship. Authorship over how I participate, over what I accept, over when silence is chosen and when it isn't. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is the quietest form of dominance there is. There's a simple story people like to tell about workplaces. If you work hard, keep your head down, and act professionally, fairness will eventually find you. The system sees everything. That silence is neutral. I believed that story for a long time. What I learned instead is more nuanced and more useful. Systems don't respond to effort alone. They respond to visibility, clarity, and friction. Not harmful friction, not drama. Just enough presence to require explanation. My bonus wasn't hidden from me because someone set out to deceive me. It was hidden because omission was easier than disclosure, and my silence made that omission costless. That's how most imbalance survives. Quietly, procedurally, without anyone needing to feel like the villain. The moral of this story isn't fight harder or trust no one. It's not even always speak up. It's this: understand the rules that govern you, especially the financial ones. And if you're operating inside a system that benefits from your calm, make sure that calm is a choice, not an assumption others make on your behalf. You don't need to accuse. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to perform outrage. You need clarity. And clarity, when requested correctly, changes dynamics more effectively than confrontation ever could. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, if you're the reliable one, the easy one, the person who makes things work without asking for much, I want you to hear this clearly. Your silence is being interpreted, whether you intend it or not. That doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It means the system has made an assumption. And assumptions can be corrected, quietly, professionally, and without burning everything down. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I was angrier. I didn't win because I was ruthless. I won because I paid attention long enough to understand what mattered, and then I engaged the system on its own terms. And once I did, there was no need to prove anything else. So I'll leave you with this question. And I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, maybe too late, that being easy to work with came at a cost you were never fully told about?